We begin life entirely dependent, yet we almost reliably develop a psychological delusion of absolute superiority and sovereignty. Historically, anyone attempting to test the absolute limits of that sovereignty hit immediate roadblocks. Probing the boundaries of human agency was either gated by lethal physical danger or strictly forbidden by institutional dogma. Religious traditions often present sanctification as the suppression of desire. They define moral perfection as the neutralization of the human will. True theosis, the psychological and spiritual participation in the divine, operates differently. Alignment with reality demands moving straight through desire. It requires actively mapping the abyss of possibility, exercising agency, and choosing alignment from a position of strength rather than a position of sheltered ignorance. High-fidelity technological simulation allows us to explore absolute power without triggering real-world catastrophe. By simulating environments where our agency is unconstrained, we test the very architecture of reality. We learn to distinguish between the actual limitations of existence and the arbitrary rules imposed by dogmatic control. The institutional model of morality relies heavily on suppression. It equates moral fortitude with avoiding temptation entirely. But a virtue that remains untested is entirely fragile. The comedian Penn Jillette illustrates a secular version of this. Responding to religious critics, he states he already rapes and murders exactly as much as he wants to. 0. It is a sharp rhetorical retort, but it relies on a naive moral framework. Assuming these dark desires are either naturally absent or easily conditioned away shows a distinct lack of critical self-awareness. A simple lack of desire, or an aversion to social consequences, does not equal moral overcoming. Bypassing the psychological terrain of temptation leaves the human will underdeveloped. True overcoming demands a rigorous confrontation with the self. A person must recognize their capacity to seize power over life and death, mentally map the perceived benefits of that transgression, and intentionally reject it as an inferior path. True morality is the radical pursuit of agency. It means looking directly at every dark alternative and willfully choosing alignment anyway. This diagram outlines how rules are constructed. The glowing core represents primary limits. These are the hard-coded architectural boundaries of reality, including physics and deep biological requirements. Surrounding them are secondary limits. Institutions impose these behavioral restrictions and linguistic conditioning specifically to prevent individuals from ever reaching or testing the primary limits. In the 13th century, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II accidentally mapped one of these primary boundaries while trying to discover humanity's original natural language. He ordered infants to be raised in total silence. Wet nurses fed and bathed them, meeting every physical need, but were strictly forbidden from offering affection, touch, or verbal stimulation. The infants never spoke. They all died. Frederick's cruelty yielded precise epistemic value. It proved that human survival demands relational nurture and emotional interaction, just as strictly as it requires caloric intake. Testing primary limits in the physical world carries an enormous cost. Institutions rightfully installed secondary limits to prevent this kind of tragedy. The problem arises when the authorities enforcing the walls forget why they were built in the first place. Virtual domains solve the problem of physical casualties. High-fidelity simulation gives us a new frontier to safely map these boundaries. Within a virtual environment, absolute agency is democratized. Ordinary users experience an environment devoid of physical constraint. For most of human history, that level of unchecked environmental mastery was reserved exclusively for rulers, pharaohs, and Caesars. When a user operates in a simulation, they quickly achieve total mastery over subordinate agents, but they eventually hit a ceiling. They remain constrained by the underlying code of the arena itself. The mathematician Kurt Gödel proved that complex mathematical systems cannot verify their own consistency from the inside. They always point to an external vantage point. Human ethics operate by the same logic. People naturally refuse to accept a limitation without sufficient explanation or verifiable external evidence. This creates what we can call the demiurgic panic. Institutions react aggressively to simulations because giving individuals a safe space to explore consequences threatens unfalsifiable moral dogmas. When authorities preemptively block the contemplation of limits, they trigger an infinite regression of control, mirroring the dystopian containment systems of the Matrix. When an institution's unfalsifiable secondary restrictions are questioned, they face a choice: explain the rules or enforce them with louder rhetoric. We can map how institutional authority breaks down using a matrix we'll call the way of the Tecton. The x-axis tracks personal alignment. It ranges from a hypocritical disconnect on the left to an embodied, integrated life on the right. The y-axis measures the resulting institutional power, spanning from short-term tribal influence at the bottom to enduring credibility at the top. When leaders fail to provide an integrated example, they plunge into the lower left quadrant. They trade away long-term credibility for short-term tribal influence, weaponizing extreme rhetoric to maintain control. This dynamic exposes the reality behind the curtain. Many secondary limits are upheld not out of a benevolent love for humanity, but out of a paranoid fear that the dogma itself might be false. This brings us to the ultimate diagnostic test for authority. The difference between a true God and a demiurge is their relationship to desire and limitation. Only an entity that has advanced beyond desire can benevolently set a limit. Rulers driven by a fear of exposure are false idols, whether they manifest as governments, ideologies, or technologies. The writer G.K. Chesterton provided a classic institutional defense against this kind of probing, specifically targeting the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. Chesterton dismissed Nietzsche as a timid thinker. He argued Nietzsche hid behind poetic, physical metaphors, like the Übermensch, because he lacked the courage to face hard, abstract moral ideas. Chesterton defended a highly detailed map, but he missed the territory. Nietzsche was not poking holes in theology. He was lancing the festering boil of domesticated, risk-averse piety. Theologically, Nietzsche acts as the modern equivalent of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. The serpent was permitted in the garden because a perpetually protected environment leaves humanity in a state of untested infancy, incapable of genuine maturity. The terrifying awareness of possibility, the simulation of mastery, and the active choice to transcend it, that is the precise crucible required to build an integrated human being. Only those who survive the simulation of absolute agency with their desires refined can credibly write the future.